He thought humiliating her would entertain the room, but in less than 5 minutes, he would wish he had never touched that piano bench. The chandelier lights of the Harrington Grand Theater shimmered against polished marble floors, casting a golden glow over rows of velvet seats where the city's elite had gathered, their tailored suits and evening gowns whispering quiet prestige with every movement. On stage, Victor Hale stood at the center of it all, his fingers gliding effortlessly across the keys of a Steinway grand, each note precise, controlled, and undeniably brilliant, the kind of performance that demanded admiration without ever asking for it. Applause rose like a wave when he finished, sharp and immediate, the kind reserved for someone who had spent a lifetime convincing the world he was untouchable. Victor didn't bow deeply, just a slight nod, as if even gratitude required too much effort, his sharp eyes scanning the audience not with appreciation, but with expectation. He was used to being the best in every room he entered, and tonight was no different. Backstage, just beyond the heavy velvet curtains, Clara Bennett moved quietly through the narrow hallway, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound against the wooden floor. At 36, she had mastered the art of being invisible, her simple gray cardigan and neatly tied hair blending into the background of a world that rarely noticed people like her. She carried a small cleaning cloth in her hand, pausing briefly near the edge of the stage where the echo of Victor's final chords still lingered in the air, her eyes lifting for just a second toward the piano. There was something in that sound that stirred a memory she never spoke about, something old and carefully buried. A stagehand brushed past her without a glance, muttering about resetting the bench, and Clara stepped aside immediately, offering a polite smile that went unseen. Moments later, Victor descended from the stage, surrounded by murmurs of admiration from event organizers and donors eager to shake his hand, his presence commanding attention like gravity itself. As he made his way down the corridor, his gaze caught a fleeting image, Clara standing near the piano, her fingers hovering just inches above the keys as if testing the air, not touching, just remembering. He stopped mid-step. For a brief second, the hallway seemed to hold its breath. Victor tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk forming as he approached, the polished heels of his shoes echoing with deliberate precision. "Careful," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something colder. "That instrument isn't exactly meant for casual curiosity." Clara's hand withdrew instantly, her posture straightening as she turned to face him, her expression calm, almost apologetic. "I was just cleaning, sir," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the sudden attention. A few nearby staff members slowed their movements, sensing the shift in tone, their eyes flickering between them. Victor let out a quiet chuckle, glancing around as if inviting an audience into the moment. "Cleaning," he repeated, the word lingering just a little too long, his smile tightening. "Right. Well, it's always fascinating how people like to pretend they understand things far beyond them." A hush began to settle, subtle at first, like a draft through an open door. Clara didn't respond. She simply stood there, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze level but unreadable. And somewhere in that silence, something shifted, something Victor didn't notice yet, but would soon remember for the rest of his life. Victor's smirk lingered just long enough to invite attention, and attention, in a place like this, spread quickly. A nearby coordinator paused mid-conversation, a donor couple subtly turned their heads, and even one of the stage technicians slowed his pace, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Victor thrived in these moments, when the room leaned in without realizing it, when curiosity could be shaped into entertainment. He stepped a little closer, folding his arms with effortless confidence, his gaze settling on Clara as though she were a puzzle already solved. "You know," he said lightly, his tone carrying just enough volume to reach those within earshot. "People spend decades mastering that instrument. It is not exactly something you pick up between cleaning shifts." A faint ripple of restrained laughter moved through the small gathering, polite but unmistakable. Clara did not react to the laughter. She lowered her eyes briefly, then lifted them again, calm and steady, as if the words had passed through her without leaving a mark. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice even, neither defensive nor submissive. That answer, simple as it was, seemed to amuse Victor even more. He tilted his head, studying her now with a sharper curiosity, as if expecting resistance and finding none had somehow disappointed him. "Do you?" he replied, a hint of challenge creeping into his voice. Because understanding something and pretending to understand it are very different things. The hallway grew quieter. Someone shifted their weight. The faint hum of conversation from the main hall felt distant now, like a different world entirely. Clara's hands remained folded, but there was a subtle stillness in her posture, something grounded, something that did not match the role everyone had already assigned to her. Victor noticed it, even if he did not yet understand it. "Tell me," he continued, glancing briefly at the piano visible through the parted curtain. "Have you ever actually played? Or do you just admire from a safe distance?" There it was, the invitation disguised as a question, the setup for something more public, more performative. A few staff members exchanged quick looks, sensing where this might lead, but no one intervened. Moments like this were not stopped. They were watched. Clara followed his gaze toward the piano, her expression unchanged, though her eyes lingered a fraction longer than before. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet steadiness, but there was something beneath it now, something deeper, harder to name. "A long time ago," she said. Victor let out a soft laugh, shaking his head as if that answer confirmed everything he had already decided. "Of course," he said, almost to himself, then louder. "Well, tonight might be your lucky night." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the stage with a casual flick of his hand, the movement drawing more attention as a few more people drifted closer, drawn by the tone, the posture, the unmistakable promise of spectacle. "Why do not we give everyone something memorable?" he suggested, his eyes returning to Clara with a glint that was no longer just amusement. "A simple demonstration. Nothing too complicated. Just enough to see how far that long time ago really goes." The air shifted again, heavier now, charged with anticipation. Clara did not move immediately. She stood there, absorbing the moment, the eyes, the expectation pressing in from all sides. And for the first time, there was a pause that felt different, not hesitation, but decision. The kind that does not announce itself, but changes everything that follows. The silence stretched just long enough to make everyone aware of it, a fragile pause suspended between expectation and uncertainty. And in that narrow space, every eye seemed to settle on Clara Bennett, as if waiting for her to either retreat or confirm what they already believed about her. Victor watched closely, his expression calm but calculating, the faint curve of his smile suggesting he had already predicted the outcome, that this moment would end exactly the way he intended, with quiet embarrassment and polite laughter. Somewhere behind him, a donor whispered something under their breath, followed by a soft chuckle, the kind that carried just enough volume to be heard without taking responsibility for it. Clara shifted her weight slightly, her gaze drifting once more toward the stage, toward the polished black surface of the piano reflecting the overhead lights like still water. The memory in her eyes deepened, not dramatic, not obvious, but present in a way that could not be ignored by anyone truly paying attention. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, and when she exhaled, something within her had already settled into place. "If that is what you would like," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle, yet carrying clearly through the quiet corridor. The reaction was immediate, a subtle ripple of surprise passing through the small crowd, as if the script had just been rewritten without warning. Victor's brows lifted slightly, just for a fraction of a second before. His composure returned, though the glint in his eyes sharpened with renewed interest. "Oh, I would very much like that," he replied smoothly, stepping aside and gesturing toward the stage with a theatrical courtesy that bordered on mockery. "After all, we are here to appreciate music, are we not?" A few more people began to gather near the curtain, drawn by the shift in energy, by the unmistakable sense that something worth witnessing was about to unfold. Clara took her first step forward, then another, her pace unhurried, each movement deliberate in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension building around her. The soft fabric of her cardigan brushed against her sides as she moved, her presence still understated, still easy to overlook, and yet somehow impossible to ignore now. As she approached the edge of the stage, the low hum of conversation from the audience filtered back into focus, unaware of the small drama about to interrupt their evening. Victor followed a few steps behind, his posture relaxed, confident, already preparing the narrative he would later tell about this moment, about the harmless amusement of inviting someone out of their depth to try something beyond them. He reached the piano first, resting his hand lightly on its polished surface as if claiming it once more, then turned to face the gathering crowd that had begun to form. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out casually, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without sounding forced. "It seems we have an unexpected guest willing to share a little music with us tonight." A few heads turned, curiosity sparked, whispers spreading like a quiet current through the room. Clara stepped onto the stage without hesitation, the soft echo of her shoes against the wooden floor marking each step as she crossed into the light. For a brief moment, she paused beside the piano, her hand hovering above the keys, not touching, just feeling the space, the air, the weight of something familiar returning after years of silence. And then, as the room slowly began to quiet, as the scattered whispers faded into a fragile stillness, Clara lowered herself onto the bench, her back straight, her hands resting gently in her lap, her eyes lifting once toward the empty sheet stand before her. No music, no preparation, just memory. And somewhere in that stillness, before a single note had been played, the room began to sense that this was no longer a joke. Victor leaned casually against the side of the piano, arms crossed, watching with the quiet confidence of someone who believed he had already won before the first move was made, his presence commanding yet detached, as if this moment existed purely for his amusement. The soft glow of the stage lights settled over Clara, illuminating the simplicity of her appearance in contrast to the grandeur of the instrument before her, and for a brief second, the entire theater seemed to hold its breath. A faint murmur drifted through the audience, a mix of curiosity and skepticism, the kind reserved for something that did not quite belong. Victor straightened slightly, glancing toward the small gathering of onlookers now forming near the front rows, his lips curving into a polite, almost charming smile that masked the condescension beneath. "Let us keep it simple," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, projecting effortlessly across the space. "Something appropriate." He reached toward the piano, tapping lightly on the polished surface as if selecting a challenge from memory. "Perhaps a Liszt etude," he added, his tone deliberate, knowing, the choice hanging in the air with unmistakable weight. A few of the more musically inclined guests exchanged quick glances, recognizing the implication immediately, the complexity, the precision required, the near impossibility for anyone without years of disciplined training. It was not just a suggestion. It was a trap. Clara did not respond right away. Her hands remained still in her lap, her posture composed, her gaze lowered toward the keys as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. Victor watched her closely now, waiting for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that she understood the scale of what had just been placed before her. "Unless, of course," he continued, his voice softening into something that almost resembled generosity, "you would prefer something easier." The words were gentle, but the meaning was unmistakable. A quiet ripple of laughter followed, restrained but present, the audience leaning into the moment, expecting the inevitable retreat. Clara's fingers lifted slowly from her lap, hovering just above the keys, not touching, not yet. The distance between her fingertips and the ivory surface was barely an inch, but it felt larger somehow, like the space between two different lives. For a fleeting moment, her reflection shimmered faintly on the polished black lid, a blurred image of who she was and who she had once been. She inhaled quietly, her shoulders rising just slightly, and then settling again as her breath left her. "No," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying clearly in the stillness. "That will be fine." The room shifted again, more noticeably this time. Someone near the aisle leaned forward, another adjusted in their seat, the subtle movements of people who sensed that something unexpected was about to unfold. Victor's smile held, but there was a flicker behind his eyes now, something sharper, something more attentive, as if a small part of him had begun to reconsider the certainty he had carried into this moment. He stepped back, giving her space, though his gaze never left her hands. Clara closed her eyes for just a second, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in recognition, as if reconnecting with something long set aside. When she opened them again, the softness in her expression remained, but beneath it, there was focus now, quiet and unwavering. Her fingers lowered, finally touching the keys with a lightness that seemed almost weightless, and in that instant, before a single note had sounded, the air itself felt different, charged with a tension that no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel. The first note fell into the air so softly that for a fraction of a second, no one was certain it had even been played, a single tone suspended in the silence like a breath held too long, delicate yet precise. And then the second note followed, and the third, each one placed with an intention so exact that the room seemed to tighten around it. Victor's expression did not change at first, his posture still relaxed, his arms still loosely crossed, but his eyes narrowed just slightly, not in doubt, but in focus, as if recalibrating something he had assumed was already understood. Clara's fingers moved with an ease that did not match her modest appearance, gliding across the keys not with hesitation, but with familiarity, as though the instrument was not something foreign to her, but something she had known intimately, something she had lived with. The opening passage unfolded cleanly, controlled, not rushed, not forced, every note carrying weight without effort, and the subtle shift in the room was immediate, almost instinctive, as conversation ceased entirely and attention sharpened into something deeper than curiosity. A man near the front row leaned forward, his brow furrowing, recognizing the structure, the phrasing, the unmistakable discipline required to maintain such control at such a tempo. Victor uncrossed his arms. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to anyone else, but it marked the first crack in the certainty he had carried into this moment. Clara did not look up. Her gaze remained lowered, her focus absolute, her hands moving now with increasing complexity, weaving through the intricate patterns of the etude with a fluidity that transformed difficulty into something almost effortless. There was no strain in her posture, no tension in her shoulders, only a quiet alignment between memory and motion, as if years of silence had not erased what once lived within her, but refined it. The tempo shifted, accelerating into a passage that demanded precision beyond instinct, and still, her fingers did not falter. A woman in the second row placed her hand gently over her mouth, her eyes widening as recognition gave way to disbelief. This was not imitation. This was mastery. Victor took a step closer to the piano, drawn not by choice, but by something he could no longer ignore, his gaze fixed on Clara's hands as they moved across the keys with unwavering control. The smirk that had once defined his expression was gone now, replaced by something quieter, something far less comfortable. Understanding. The music built, rising in intensity, the cascading notes filling the theater with a presence that demanded more than attention. It demanded respect, and with each passing measure, the narrative Victor had constructed in his mind began to unravel. This was not a simple demonstration. This was not a moment of amusement. This was something else entirely. Clara's hands crossed seamlessly, her movements precise, deliberate, her timing flawless, and for the first time since the performance began, she allowed herself the smallest shift in expression, not pride, not defiance, but something softer, something that belonged to the music itself. The final run of the passage approached, fast, unforgiving, the kind that exposed even the smallest imperfection, and yet when it arrived, it was executed with such clarity that the air seemed to hold it in place, each note landing exactly where it belonged, no more, no less. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the phrase resolved, the final note lingering in the space like a quiet truth that could no longer be denied. The room did not react immediately. There was no applause, no whisper, no movement. Only silence. And in that silence, Victor Hale stood completely still, staring at the woman he had dismissed, realizing, perhaps for the first time in years, that he was no longer the most extraordinary musician in the room. The silence did not break immediately, and that delay carried more weight than any applause ever could, stretching across the theater like an unspoken acknowledgement that something undeniable had just taken place. Clara's hands remained lightly resting on the keys for a brief moment after the final note faded, as if she were allowing the music to fully settle before she moved, her posture still composed, her breathing steady, untouched by the tension that had gripped everyone else. Victor stood only a few feet away, but the distance between them had changed in a way that no one could measure, his eyes fixed on her hands, then slowly lifting to her face, searching for something that might explain what he had just witnessed. The confidence that once defined him had not vanished entirely, but it had shifted, fractured in subtle ways that revealed uncertainty beneath the surface. A man in the front row exhaled audibly, the sound breaking the silence like a small crack in glass, followed by another movement, then another, until the room began to stir again, though cautiously, as if afraid to disturb what had just been revealed. Clara lifted her hands from the piano, her fingers hovering for a fraction of a second before she gently lowered them into her lap once more, her gaze remaining downward, not seeking approval, not acknowledging the attention now fully fixed upon her. She had not played for them. That much was clear. Victor took another step closer, slower this time, his movements no longer guided by performance, but by something far more deliberate. "That," he began, but the word did not carry the same certainty it once would have, trailing off as he searched for something adequate, something that could contain what he had just heard. He cleared his throat softly, regaining a measure of composure, though the edge in his voice had dulled. That was unexpected. The word felt insufficient the moment it left his lips, and he knew it. A faint murmur passed through the audience, not laughter this time, but something quieter, something closer to realization. Clara finally looked up, her eyes meeting his, steady and calm, without challenge, without triumph, simply present. "Music is not about expectations," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard, yet without any need to assert itself. The simplicity of her words settled into the space between them, and for a moment, Victor had no response. He glanced toward the audience, then back at the piano, as if recalibrating the world he thought he understood. "Where did you train?" he asked, more directly now, the question no longer framed as a test, but as a need. Clara's expression softened slightly, though her composure remained unchanged. "A long time ago," she replied again, the same answer, but this time it carried a different weight, no longer dismissible, no longer vague, but intentional. Victor studied her, the repetition of those words echoing in his mind, and something began to connect, faintly. At first, then with growing clarity. There was a familiarity in her phrasing, in her interpretation, in the restraint she had shown where others might have sought to impress. This was not just skill. This was history. A woman near the aisle leaned toward her companion, whispering something urgently, her eyes wide with recognition, and that whisper spread, quiet but persistent, like a current moving through the room. Victor heard fragments, names half-formed, references not yet complete, but enough to unsettle him further. He looked at Clara again, really looked this time, beyond the cardigan, beyond the simplicity, searching for the person he had failed to see. And in that moment, the realization did not arrive all at once, but it began, slowly, inevitably, like a truth that could no longer be ignored. The whispers grew louder now, no longer contained to a single corner of the room, but spreading in quiet waves from one cluster of guests to another, each voice carrying fragments of recognition that slowly assembled into something undeniable. A man near the front leaned toward his companion, his voice low but urgent, repeating a name with a tone that suggested disbelief rather than certainty. Another guest straightened in their seat, eyes narrowing as memory aligned with what they had just witnessed, the pieces falling into place one by one. Victor heard it this time, clearly enough that it cut through the lingering silence like a precise note striking true. Bennett. Clara Bennett. The name settled into his mind with a weight that shifted everything. His gaze returned to her immediately, sharper now, searching her face with a new intensity, as if seeing her for the first time without the filter of assumption. The simplicity of her clothing, the quietness of her demeanor, the absence of any attempt to draw attention, all of it now felt deliberate rather than ordinary. A choice, not a limitation. "That is not possible," Victor said under his breath, though the conviction in his voice was already fading, replaced by something closer to realization. He had heard the name before, years ago, spoken with a kind of reverence reserved for those who did not simply perform music, but redefined it. A prodigy who had risen quickly, astonishing audiences with a depth of interpretation far beyond her years, and then, just as suddenly, disappeared. No farewell tour. No final performance. Just silence. Clara did not respond to the murmurs or the shifting energy in the room. She rose slowly from the bench, smoothing the fabric of her cardigan with a small, habitual gesture, her movements as composed as they had been when she first stepped onto the stage. The attention did not seem to reach her in the same way it reached everyone else. Victor took a step closer, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier performance, carrying something more personal, more uncertain. "You left," he said, the words forming without structure, without the confidence he was known for. Clara met his gaze again, and for the first time, there was something in her eyes that acknowledged the past, not with regret, but with acceptance. "Yes," she said simply. The answer did not invite further explanation, and yet it carried enough to confirm everything he had begun to understand. Victor exhaled slowly, his shoulders shifting as the realization settled fully into place, the weight of it undeniable now. The woman he had dismissed, the one he had turned into a moment of amusement, was not an outsider to this world. She had once stood at its very center. A quiet stillness returned to the room, but it was no longer uncertain. It was reverent. Someone in the audience began to clap, a single, measured sound that echoed through the theater, followed by another, and then another, until the applause built into something full, something sustained, not polite, not obligatory, but earned. Clara did not bow. She did not step forward to acknowledge it. She simply stood there for a moment, allowing the sound to exist without claiming it, her gaze drifting briefly across the audience before returning to the piano. Victor remained where he was, the applause washing over him without meaning, his focus fixed entirely on her, on the quiet strength that had replaced every assumption he had made. And in that moment, the hierarchy he had relied on for so long no longer felt certain, no longer felt stable, because the person he had tried to place beneath him had just revealed a truth he could not outrun, no matter how loudly the room responded. The applause continued, steady and unwavering, filling every corner of the theater with a sound that no longer belonged to expectation, but to recognition. And yet Clara Bennett did not absorb it the way others might have. She did not lean into it or allow it to define the moment. Instead, she stepped back from the piano with quiet composure, her presence as grounded as it had been before a single note was played. Victor remained motionless for a few seconds longer, the weight of the realization settling deeper with every passing heartbeat, until finally he exhaled and moved forward, not with the confident stride he was known for, but with something slower, more deliberate, as though each step required a recalibration of who he believed himself to be. The applause began to soften as people noticed the shift, their attention returning to the stage, to the space between them, where the dynamic had changed in a way no one could ignore. Victor stopped a few feet from Clara, his expression no longer guarded by arrogance, but open in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. "I did not know," he said, his voice carrying clearly, though without the projection he had used before, the words simple, unembellished, and honest in a way that silenced the remaining echoes of applause. Clara regarded him for a moment, her gaze steady, not accusatory, not triumphant, simply present. "You did not ask," she replied, her tone calm, not unkind, but unmistakably direct. The words settled into the space between them with a quiet finality that no one in the room could miss. A faint murmur passed through the audience again, not of disbelief this time, but of understanding, as the simplicity of the truth revealed something larger than the moment itself. Victor nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her response, his eyes lowering briefly before returning to meet hers again. "That is true," he admitted, the acknowledgement coming without resistance, without defense. He glanced toward the piano, then back at Clara, as if searching for a way to reconcile what had just happened with everything he had built his identity upon. "Would you?" he began, then paused, the question forming carefully, no longer driven by ego, but by something closer to respect. "Would you play again?" The room seemed to lean in once more, not with the same tension as before, but with a quiet anticipation that felt entirely different, no longer rooted in spectacle, but in genuine curiosity. Clara considered the question for a brief moment, her eyes drifting toward the instrument, then back to Victor, and there was a softness in her expression now, not toward him specifically, but toward the music itself. "No," she said gently, shaking her head once. The decision clear but not dismissive. That was enough. Victor held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded again, this time with a deeper understanding, as if recognizing that the moment did not need to be extended to prove anything further. The lesson had already been delivered, not through confrontation, not through humiliation, but through something far more enduring. Clara turned then, stepping away from the center of the stage, her movements quiet, unhurried, as she began to leave the light behind, returning toward the same path she had walked before, unnoticed, unremarkable, and yet now entirely changed in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed her. The audience remained silent as she moved, no longer applauding, no longer speaking, simply watching, as if understanding that any sound might break something fragile and important that had just taken place. Victor stayed where he was, his gaze following her until she disappeared beyond the edge of the curtain, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to fill the silence, because in that stillness, he had already learned more than any performance could have ever taught him. The curtain settled softly behind Clara as she disappeared from view, and for a moment, no one moved, as if the entire theater had been suspended in a kind of quiet reflection that no applause could interrupt, no voice could quite capture. The grandeur of the Harrington Grand Theater remained unchanged, the chandeliers still casting their golden glow, the velvet seats still filled with the city's most refined audience. And yet something intangible had shifted, something deeper than performance, something that lingered in the air long after the final note had faded. Victor Hale stood alone beside the piano, his hand resting lightly against its polished surface, but this time, there was no sense of ownership in the gesture, only a quiet acknowledgement of what the instrument had just revealed. The audience began to stir gradually, not with the usual rush of conversation or polite commentary, but with measured voices, thoughtful glances, and the kind of subdued energy that followed something truly unexpected. A man in the front row shook his head slowly, as if trying to reconcile what he had witnessed with everything he thought he knew, while a woman nearby dabbed at her eyes, not out of sadness, but out of something far more difficult to define. Victor's gaze remained fixed on the space where Clara had stood, his expression no longer shaped by ego or performance, but by reflection, the kind that does not arrive quickly and does not leave easily. He replayed the moment in his mind, not the music itself, but the choices he had made before it began, the assumptions, the words, the tone, each one now carrying a weight he had not felt at the time. Around him, the theater slowly returned to motion, guests rising from their seats, conversations beginning to form, though quieter than before, more careful, as if everyone understood, on some level, that they had witnessed something that extended beyond a simple performance. Victor straightened slightly, drawing in a slow breath, and for the first time that evening, he looked not toward the audience, but inward, examining the part of himself that had been so certain, so quick to define others without understanding them. He turned toward the crowd, their eyes still lingering on him, waiting perhaps for a remark, a recovery, a return to the familiar persona they expected. But Victor did not offer a performance this time. He did not fill the silence with charm or wit or carefully crafted words. Instead, he gave a small, genuine nod, not to reclaim the moment, but to acknowledge it, and then stepped back from the piano, leaving the center of the stage empty. Backstage, beyond the reach of the lights and the quiet intensity of the audience, Clara moved through the narrow corridor just as she had before, her pace steady, her expression calm, the faint echo of the performance still present in her mind, though she did not linger on it. A stagehand passed her again, this time pausing briefly, offering a respectful nod that had not been there before. Clara returned the gesture with a soft smile, nothing more, nothing less, as she continued on her way. She did not seek recognition, and she did not carry the need to be seen, because what mattered had already been expressed, not in words, but in something far more lasting. And back in the theater, as the lights dimmed slightly and the evening prepared to move forward, there remained a quiet understanding shared among those who had been present, a realization that lingered long after the moment had passed, that true mastery does not announce itself, does not demand attention, and does not rely on appearances to prove its worth. And on that night, in a room built for excellence, the most powerful lesson had come not from the man everyone expected, but from the woman no one thought to notice.